Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming in today. We have a special panel discussion prepared for everyone on a great documentary, COVID's Hidden Toll, which examines how the COVID crisis has hit vulnerable immigrants and undocumented workers. The documentary itself follows the coronavirus pandemic's invisible victims, including crucial farm and meatpacking workers who lack protections and who unfortunately have been bearing the brunt of our coronavirus pandemic. I'm joined here today with Daffodil Altan and Andres Sigil, who I'll give a longer description of their bios and what they're here to kind of talk about the film. I'm going to start with Daffodil, who's an investigative journalist and Emmy-nominated producer and correspondent. Previously was a producer at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism's Investigative Reporting program and a producer at Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting. She has produced and written for MSNBC, Telemundo, KQED, Reveal, PBS NewsHour, Univision, the Los Angeles Times, Mother Jones, Associated Press, and OC Weekly, where she was also a staff writer. She has a master's degree from UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism, where she is also a lecturer. And so I think there's going to be a follow-up with UC Berkeley representation also here with Andres, who's a documentary filmmaker as well, and professor of visual journalism. Some of the projects that you've worked on include A Rape in the Fields, and you were a writer and producer of Rape on the Night Shift, which brought to light rampant sexual assault of immigrant women in the agricultural and janitorial industries. You graduated from Brown University and received your master's degree in journalism from the University of California, Berkeley. So with that, I want to thank you both for joining us and to talk about this great documentary. But I also do want to turn it over to Erin, our kind of co-host for this evening, to introduce herself and what she's been doing with the university. So Erin.
Hey everyone, thank you, Guillermo. My name is Erin Meyer. I'm the Sustainable Food Programs Coordinator. I coordinate multiple programs regarding food rescue, food waste, food security, such as the pop-up People's Pantry, the People's Fridge, a new community fridge that we're opening soon in Merced. And I'm just interested in all things sustainable. So we started a sustainable film series, and this is one of them. We also show growing solutions and a whole host of others. So I'm really excited to discuss this because it's a very timely set of issues, really. And I think this is going to be a really hard-hitting, really interesting conversation.
Perfect. And finish it off with Guillermo Ortiz. I am a Sustainability and Diversity Educational Programs Manager with the Office of Sustainability. And so I'm really looking forward to a conversation that really kind of looks at our agricultural system and equity or the lack of equity within it. I want to turn it over. I'll start with Daffodil if you want to introduce yourself further and kind of open up. And then after that, Andres, feel free to follow.
Sure, just unmuting myself. Yeah, Andres and I have been working on films together for 8 years or so, and we've been focused a lot on agricultural communities, undocumented workers, exploited workers, vulnerable workers, really looking at the ways that exploitation plays out in the workplace. So we also did a film looking, for example, on labor trafficking in the US and how that plays out. And we took apart a case involving Guatemalan teenagers who were forced to work at an Ohio egg farm and sort of the components that allowed for that to happen. So, you know, our work, I mean, at Reveal, I did different work. I looked at solitary confinement among teenagers, but really, I would say overall, my investigative work is sort of focused on vulnerable populations, whether it's children, teenagers, the criminal justice system, immigration, and workplace safety and abuse issues.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Guillermo, and everybody who helped organize this event. I'm really happy to be here and share this work with you all. I think one of the things, you know, Daffodil's talking about all the work that we've done together, and for me, so much of the work actually begins once we've finished the film, and then we're able to share it with the world, because that's the whole point. So I'm really appreciative of all you for being here Friday afternoon and a holiday weekend to talk about these issues, which have not gone away. The film came out about 6 weeks ago, or getting close to 2 months or whenever it was, and nothing's really changed. And if anything, it's gotten worse. And now there's heat advisories, and there's smoke in the air, and there's COVID, and people are still going out to work. So I'm glad that we're having this discussion to keep the issue alive.
Yeah, thank you. And that's an interesting question, right? With the onset of the COVID pandemic, there's so many different angles that you can really explore the issue, and who's being left behind, right? Obviously, there's a public health aspect and perspective that you can take. Can you kind of elaborate a little bit more on the focus on immigrant workers or undocumented workers in the agricultural system, right? Why was that such a important aspect to focus on here in this documentary?
When we went into shelter in place in the country, California was the first state to issue shelter in place orders. And so all of us went inside, and all of us started kind of huddling, and at Frontline, we were starting to talk about what should we do, what stories should we cover. And in talking at Frontline and talking with Andres and talking with some of our other journalist collaborators that we worked on Rape in the Fields and Rape on the Night Shift with, we started thinking about, right now we're at home and all we can do is go out and get food, and everything's very limited. And so we started just immediately went to what's going to happen in the agricultural community, what's going to happen with the farm workers. We just kind of started asking ourselves, and then we started asking sources and people that we trust, what do they think is going to happen? They are deemed essential workers. They were deemed essential workers at the time, essential industry. But there was a shortage, right? There was a shortage of PPE that we all remember, and they were facing those shortages too. But we knew from our years of reporting that this was a much more vulnerable population, prone to exploitation, prone to not speaking up because they are targeted, because so many are undocumented. So we just started asking and thinking about, what is this going to look like as if the virus intensifies? And we were hearing, well, the harvest is coming, and people who live in different parts of California, longtime California residents who are farm workers, have been moving around the state, going to Arizona. So all of that movement, we were hearing, could potentially lead to infections. They didn't have PPE. There wasn't a lot of information. So we kind of just decided to start following and tracking this story as it was evolving, as well as also starting to probe the meatpacking industry, because these stories we started to hear about infections in meatpacking plants, and there are meatpacking plants in California as well. So we kind of just started reporting and canvassing and seeing what that would lead to.
Yeah, and it's an interesting kind of topic in terms of, I'm thinking of in the film, like you're talking about this label of essential worker, right? And there's a line, from one of the workers, right, where he says, it doesn't feel like we're essential workers; it feels like we're slaves, right? And that concept of being labeled essential but being treated like you're replaceable, right? Now, could you kind of elaborate on how those feelings were manifesting for workers, right? This dichotomy between, you're a hero, and then at the same time, if you don't show up to work, we're going to fire you. How does that work? How does that feel for those workers who you were speaking to?
Right. There was this sense of, you're suddenly deemed critical to the country's infrastructure. You're critical. You have to keep working because otherwise people won't eat. And you're given this label of importance, but at the same time, especially if you're undocumented, you're being also criminally targeted. So there's that problem, right? You're just psychologically, it's I'm critically important to the country, but I'm also potentially could be I'm criminalized and I could be deported at any moment. So that, if you're somebody who just has a family and children and you're trying to go to work every day and those two things are playing out in the middle of a pandemic, it's just a lot to shoulder. And then on top of that, you get to work and you don't have protective equipment. You don't have, you know, separation happening, you know, all these things that you're hearing about that are maybe supposed to happen aren't necessarily happening at work, especially in meatpacking. We were finding, you know, where people are kind of confined and working in close quarters, all of these precautions that needed to be taken to protect them, these essential workers, you know, were not necessarily being taken, or being taken in piecemeal, or information was withheld. And so there's this awful sense of, I'm important because Americans need to eat and everyone is shuttered at home right now, but also I don't even have the basics to protect my life and the health and safety of my own family. So I don't, Andres might have something else to add, but that's just.
Yeah, I mean, it's the situation where I think when a lot of the discussion about the essential workers and the heroes was happening, a lot of what was being talked about in the media had to do with frontline workers, hospital workers, nurses. We need to support them because they're on the front lines. They're essential to us being able to survive as a society. Whereas this group of essential workers were a group of people who didn't have a choice. You know, most people, you know, if you sign up to be a doctor, you're signing up. If you sign up to be a law enforcement person, you're signing up to do something where you're putting yourself on the line. There's a safety component to that you know about. It's part of the job description. But a lot of people will end up doing farm work. Not everybody, but a lot of people are doing it because that's what's available to them. So they don't have a choice. They're signing up because they're trying to feed their family, because they want to do honest, hard labor to be able to provide, not because they want to be risking their lives. And so this was a situation where, yes, they were essential because they all wanted to eat, but this wasn't a choice that they were making so much as it was a choice that they were having to make.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, I think that best, you know, when I was watching the film, that kind of theme resonated a lot with Cynthia Hernandez, right? You know, who had cancer, has diabetes, so has pre-existing conditions, and yet, you know, she has her mother living with her, as well as taking care of folks who do have disabilities. You know, I think she does say, you know, my options are to go out and work, or protect my family, and not only protect her family but herself, right? And there is that really kind of like almost like nerve-wracking moment when you're watching the documentary where she's calling to get you know, her COVID test results, right? There's that, you know, there's this like buildup of tension before ultimately getting that kind of getting that she tested negative, right? Which is a huge sigh of relief for her family, but it's kind of bittersweet, right? There's that sense of, but she's going to have to go out again the next day, right? That negative testing does not mean that she's safe, or that the people that we've seen are safe, right? And how does that constant, even like for most people, hearing that phone call would be amazing and that would be the end of it, but like they have to go out again and again and again, right? So what can Andres or Daffodil, can you tell me kind of what that feeling is like from them, like from your conversations with them? You know, is that taxing? Is that taking a toll in addition just the physical nature of the labor that they're doing, right? Seems like to be there's this constant anxiety. Is that what you were seeing when you were going out? And
I think it's definitely a constant anxiety. I think that, you know, and there's this thing where, you know, we're all living in the pandemic. You know, some of us may be able to work from home, but we're all living in this situation where we don't know if and how we might get it. And if you've been tested, you know what the feeling is to be waiting for the results, and how long is it going to take, and then what does it mean? And if you come up negative, it's like, oh, there's a sigh of relief, but all that meant was that I was negative 4 days ago. What could happen now? And so for the people who have to keep on going out every day, it is this constant anxiety. And there's also a situation where, and we heard this, and a lot of this reporting was done at the beginning of the pandemic when not a lot was known, but there was this idea that I might get reinfected again. And of course, the science is not conclusive yet. it's likely that you won't be reinfected again. But, you know, people still have that feeling that it could happen. And now what we're seeing, there was just some reporting that was coming out that this wave of infections at meatpacking plants is starting all over again. And one of the reasons is because to the point you were making earlier, Guillermo, about whether you're essential and replaceable, you're actually both. Because if you stop going to work, they will find somebody else to take your place. So when people get sick, for instance, at a meatpacking plant, and they send them home and they quarantine them, somebody else comes in. And so it's almost like a constant supply of workers who can get reinfected all over again. And that's why we're not seeing any of the infection rates go down. So for instance, when we were starting, this was just, the infections were just starting. We focused mostly on Monterey County. And at that time, the Central Valley was doing relatively well. Well, of course, now the Central Valley is one of the hot spots of the state. And if you look at the positivity rates, the counties with the highest positivity rates are the agricultural counties. I think it's, you know, it's Madera, it's Fresno, it's Kings County, and even Monterey, which supposedly, if you talk to officials there, are doing a good job. The positivity rate is over 10%. So this far into the pandemic, the problem hasn't gotten better. The problem is getting worse. And it's not just in these agricultural counties, it's throughout the society. But we've seen that there have been very few measures put in place. None of them are mandatory, and the problem just keeps going on.
And Daffodil, I'm going to kind of direct this question to you, and because you mentioned that you were kind of had already been looking kind of into the conditions at these meatpacking plants, right? When I was watching the film, I was pretty surprised to the degree of self-regulation that many of these businesses were operating with, like, you know, basically guidelines that were completely voluntary. Was that something that was kind of the norm across the industry as a whole? Is that kind of generally how the federal government treats these businesses, or and has that changed, right, as the pandemic has evolved and they started seeing those hot spots or those outbreaks at these meatpacking plants? Was there ever really any kind of shift into thinking, you know, maybe we need to make these a little bit stricter, or you know, make sure people are taking necessary precautions to protect their workers? Can you show me what the evolution was?
Yeah, some of what this has been called. I mean, there have been advocates and around the country who have called for what they're calling emergency COVID-19 standards. That federal OSHA, they wanted federal OSHA to issue kind of blanket standards for the country, so that all states could follow certain, you know, companies could follow certain protocols that OSHA could enforce, and that there would be some kind of standard. That effort that is still stalled. The federal OSHA still to date hasn't issued anything uniform that all states must follow. And in the beginning, this was essential businesses. The ask was, please give the essential businesses that have to keep operating, give us all, you know, something uniform to follow. That's what some of the advocates of the workers, people were asking for. The government didn't. 21 unions, I think, banded together, sued, tried to get the government to implement these emergency standards. Didn't happen, hasn't happened. So states that have OSHAs have, you know, so then there's petitions or there's efforts to try to get state OSHAs to implement some kind of protocol that all companies, especially now it's really becoming all companies because everything's opening up. At the time of our reporting, it was the essential businesses that had to keep operating while this, you know, while we were still trying to understand how the virus operates, how does it spread. You know, there's new reporting every day almost on aerosol and, you know, distance and indoors. We're still learning so much. So at the time it was like, give us something that we must all do, but it just wasn't happening. And we were actually surprised. I think when we were doing our reporting, I expected to find that Cal OSHA had some standard that companies had to follow in place. And we were hearing from sources, and once we looked more closely, no, it's actually all, you know, voluntary. It's, you know, what you should do, what you could do. Companies are expected to have their own like like plan for the company. That's what OSHA requires of them. But again, that's, you know, it's nothing enforceable per se. So Virginia actually became the first state that's going to adopt mandatory standards for all companies. And this was actually brought on by, you know, I think it was poultry farms out there and legal advocates who pushed and pushed, and activists who said we need these emergency standards. And so now they're going to be the only state to have something widespread. There's like 7 or 8 other states that have some things in the works that are, you know, things are changing. And California actually in the last month, the governor has pledged to look at the OSHA guidelines. And even recently, the assembly member that's in our film passed legislation. And part of that legislation is going to require OSHA to enforce its guidelines more. So it's like this, it's still not a totally concrete set of standards, but the guidelines that are in place, they're looking at having companies have to adhere to those. And so the governor has been working with, you know, advocates, representatives to try to find a way. You know, there's all this negotiating going on still, but they're looking for, people are still pushing for just enforceable standards that you can just say, hey, here's what you're supposed to follow, and that you as a worker can know, hey, here's what my company's supposed to do. They have to do this, and if they don't, I'm going to call OSHA, or I'm going to report them, or I'm going to do something. But without that in place, it's very confusing for workers, because they think they should be told that, you know, that there's an infection at the work site. Well, it turns out the companies, businesses don't have to tell their workers about infections at the work site. That's not legally required. But you kind of think as a worker that I should know, right? So there's all these gaps in what companies have to do, and right now there's not much that they have to do.
You know, and what I loved about the film is that it covers really like a multi-layered problem, right? So I'm thinking of obviously the labor issues that are present throughout the film, but I think one part that you could tell in some of the stories was this issue of healthcare access, right? That there's these folks who had pre-existing conditions who are worried about, you know, if I get sick, one, should I go to a doctor, right? And then if they are undocumented, right, having those symptoms, being listed as someone who's COVID positive, does that bring me under more attention from the federal government? Does that open me up to potential deportation, et cetera? You know, in addition, right, I think one part that really just like hit me was, I believe it was Cynthia again in the film, where she lays out the pill containers, right, for her cancer treatments on the table, really taking up a good amount of surface space. Meanwhile, right, and in the same film, people talking about, you know, it's difficult for me to have the funds to purchase, you know, $3 to $4 masks at the same time. Can you kind of tell me, was that an intentional kind of aspect of that you were trying to reveal, right? It's not just immigration issues, it's not just the labor issues. Was there also kind of this like underlying healthcare access perspective that you were also trying to kind of elevate in terms of how these people are vulnerable in multiple fronts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it wasn't even that, it's like it's all there. I mean, it's kind of just factually what's there. And we actually, what was challenging was there was a lot that we wanted to include. There's like a long list, right? It's like salaries are extremely low for farm workers, healthcare access, underlying health conditions, your status, you know, and so many farm workers and agricultural workers being undocumented. I mean, it's just like ride sharing. There's just like layered, and then there was public charge, which was a policy that President Trump introduced and implemented in like February that sent this mixed message to immigrant communities around the country. There's so many things at play. And then just sort of the historical kind of trajectory for the agricultural workers and farm workers in particular, and just how little they have still in terms of protections and rights. I mean, there's so many things that we couldn't, you know, it's like we wanted to get all of that in, and in order for a film to happen and a story to happen, you can't, so, you know, but really it's like you meet somebody like Cynthia and she's kind of living a lot of these, these things are evoked because that's what you're living, that's what your life is. And so even though we couldn't like hit them on the head and sort of bullet point all of them, I think you start to feel midway and by the end of the film, like there's a lot of things at play here. You know, she has to ride in a van, but she has cancer, she can't afford the gas, she can't buy a mask, she's got bills, I mean, you just start seeing like, she's very emblematic of a lot of people's situations where there's like 6 different things that are stacked against you, and not least of which is your very small paycheck that you have to, you know, that keeps you working because you have family to support. So yeah, I mean, it's like we kept trying to, you know, there was a lot that we wanted to hit on. We wanted to talk about public charge, but then we're limited by the constraints of the hour and storytelling. So it is the challenge of filmmaking, but definitely those issues are there. They're real. We've touched on them in other films in different ways, but you know, they weigh so heavily in terms of just like trying to live out your daily life and go to work and take care of your family.
No, absolutely. It really did feel like a sort of like a window into just the multiple public policy failures that we have in the country right now, right? Our healthcare system isn't catching these people. Our labor system isn't robust enough to allow these people to have the wages that they should, right? It just seemed like we were looking at the failure, both in terms of state, local, and federal governments, right? Inability to have public policy that really protects these people. And, you know, this leads me to a question, and maybe Andres, you can answer this for me. One of the things that I really enjoyed in the film was the perspective of when you were doing the interviews with the immigrant workers or the undocumented workers. It was very close up, right? Personal, intimate. And I think that allowed me to connect in a really real way. I think there was a couple shots where it's, you know, the people are sitting in their truck and talking with them. You know, can you kind of talk to me about how you kind of craft those kind of scenes, right? Is that meant to invoke that kind of feeling for an audience member or something like that? Can you kind of go into that?
Definitely. I mean, I think with all of our work, we're always trying to create a space in which you can understand where that person is coming from. And so there's a lot of different filmmaking techniques that we do to create what ends up being an intimate space, because people are often revealing, you know, feelings that can be very sensitive, whether it's fear or anger or vulnerability. So there's a lot that goes into making those spaces work, and that has a lot to do with the directors and the producers and the crew on the ground. The specific situations that you're talking about actually came about because of COVID. So when we started filming, it was in the early days of the pandemic. It wasn't really very clear how the virus was spreading. And what we decided to do is, at the very minimum, we were going to shoot outside. And so for purely production purposes, we ended up shooting in people's cars. When you shoot outside, you got to deal with the sun, you got to deal with the wind, you got to deal with all these factors that can make it difficult for the light and for the sound. But the car became a space where they were a little bit enclosed. So it was a very pragmatic reason, and it had the, I think, effect of also being very personal, because cars often say a lot about who we are, and a lot of us were spending a lot of time in our cars. So there definitely was a lot of thought that went into that in a production way. Daffodil, were you going to add to that?
No, I was just thinking of Rosa. I mean, Rosa, who's a truck driver, she was one of the most, I think that's one of the most dynamic interviews, because she really is a part of her truck, and so it just worked out that way. But yeah, we had all this distance, and the wind was blowing, and you know, the car actually serves as a sound shield, so it helps.
And we couldn't film in their house. I mean, we couldn't go to their house. They wouldn't let us come to their house. Yeah. You know, there was, you know, they had just had a COVID outbreak, and the mother was like, no, nobody's coming into the house. Yeah. You know, we didn't necessarily even want to, but then it became difficult because there weren't even other public spaces where we could go to. So it was really out of necessity that we came up with that technique.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, you really were able to get some beautiful and intimate interviews out of that. So, you know, both in terms of the pandemic forcing that style, it did come out beautifully. I quickly saw a question that came from the chat that I want to work into the discussion, if you don't mind. One about, was it particularly difficult to get some interviews with some of the agricultural workers? I did notice, for example, right, some people felt comfortable revealing their identity, others didn't. Could you kind of talk about what your experience was in trying to get people to tell their story and tell their experiences and the barriers, obviously, especially on the labor side, if they were talking about their employers or their managers or supervisors, what kind of dynamics did that play in kind of who was, did you have to, talk some people a little bit more into talking with you, or was it just a kind of, it doesn't seem like, they're interested? Like, can you kind of describe that process, either Daffodil or Andres?
Sure. And it's great. I can't read all the chats right now, but yeah, if there's chat questions, it's great to hear from people. It was really hard to get people to talk and go on camera. It's always a real challenge, especially when you're working with vulnerable worker populations. And then this was COVID, and I mean, we talked to like dozens of people. I mean, we talked to a lot of farm workers. We were following multiple cases around the state. I mean, we had another meat packing plant. There was a date plant. We were talking to workers all over the state, basically. And everybody, there were different situations at different levels. There were critically ill people. I mean, there were so many things going on. The people who actually are in the film are a fragment of the number of people that our reporting team was talking to at once. And then the ones who are in the film, it's like a miracle they're even in the film, because what would be the reason that you'd want to talk to a film crew right now in the middle of COVID? I mean, I'm always stunned. It's really brave of people to decide to just go on camera, especially, Osmad, his brother, who didn't even make the cut. They'd just come out of isolation the day before, so they were still kind of weak. And it's this very particular combination of, talking to the right people, talking to organizations that work on the ground directly with agricultural workers, farm workers, making contact. Sometimes we get to people that way. We got to Cynthia through an organization called Líderes Campesinas, who's made up of farm worker women, and Cynthia volunteers with them, and they said, hey, maybe you should talk to Cynthia. So we met her, and we really talk to people, and we're transparent about, this is what we're doing, this is the story we're telling. And if they decide to tell their story, do you want to tell your story? Will you tell your story? Then we go and we record it. We don't try to convince anyone. We sort of stay away from that because we don't want people to feel pressured into talking. We don't want them to feel like they'll regret it or there'll be repercussions. Someone has to go into an interview very clear-headed, despite everything that's swirling on around them, which is what was extraordinary about Cynthia and the Orellanas, is that they had COVID basically swirling around them. Cynthia has all these health conditions, and they still decided, I'm gonna sit down, I'm gonna speak very clearly, authentically about what's happening right now. And I think that's part of the power, but it's just, we were so close to getting a handful of other interviews that would have been incredible. Including, the manager and the scene later on, when you hear from the anonymous woman who's telling the story of Taylor Farms, and you watch the video footage that she shot. We were in conversation with the manager as well. He very much wanted to go on camera. The company didn't authorize it, but that would have been a really fascinating interview that, we just get real close to things sometimes as journalists, as filmmakers, and you can only put in the film what you get, right? So, but in terms of people who were not showing their faces, there's just also so much risk. I mean, the woman in the same example who tells her story, she was very upset, felt like an injustice had been committed. However, she still needed that paycheck. She could not afford to lose that job. So it's that tension of feeling like you need to speak out, but also feeling like you don't have the protection to keep your job if you do speak out.
Yeah, and you know what, that raises another question. You said as a filmmaker, you can get really you get really close, not both in terms of physical proximity, but also emotionally. What were some of the takeaways that you took from this film project that kind of stuck with you, either stories from the folks that you were talking to or just the subject matter in particular? What kind of, what did you take home from this film?
Well, this is one of the only times, a lot of times we're reporting on something that's happened to someone else, or a situation, or, something going on, and like rape on the night shift, it was sexual assault in the workplace. And so you're not always experiencing or going through the same thing that the subjects of the film are going through or have been through. But in this moment, we were all in this under this COVID cloud that was very intense. Being in the field, doing the interviews, it was just like the weight of COVID was everywhere. And that was different. That was unlike anything. Obviously, I've never done a film in a pandemic. I've never, so there's this like, you're talking with people who have just had COVID, who are afraid of getting COVID, who might have COVID, and they're going to go get tested, and you're also wearing your masks, and you're with your crew. So that has stayed in terms of the fear of COVID that we were all sharing in. And then you go home and you realize, as in terms of my specific job, I would go out in the field and then I'd come home and I could stay indoors again, and there would be some relief. But then I would always be thinking about everyone we were just talking to is still going out every day to work. They're still dealing with this every day. So that, no matter how hard quarantine might have felt or still feels sometimes, it's just like that's very present for me. It's just that there are other people who haven't had the privilege of quarantine yet, ever.
And Andres, same question to you. What did you personally take away from this experience?
I think something that was really surprising, because I've done a lot of reporting in the agricultural community prior to this, and it's one of those situations where the community is suffering through so many different challenges all the time, the list that we've been talking about, and then you put COVID on top of that, and it really was a sense of this is too much. This is like you're watching people who are really at a point where it feels like they're going to break. It's like, how many more challenges can these people be suffering through all at the same time without any kind of safety net, and being persecuted by the government in some cases. And so it's been this lingering feeling of worry that we've shown a spotlight on this. And then, we have panels like this, but who else is paying attention and who else is doing things? I mentioned the positivity rates in the Central Valley right now are still really high. And then, of course, there's the fires and the smoke and the heat. And it's really, in a way that I hadn't seen it before, shown how precarious our food system is and how dependent we are on a workforce that is really stretched to its limits. So it's been kind of a lingering sense of worry for this community. One of the things that came out at the end of the film was a study that was done out of UC San Diego that was showing that in counties where there's farm workers, the more farm workers there are, the more people die from COVID. And then there was a part of the study that we didn't mention when I talked to the researcher, which was a finding that was really concerning, is without getting into the data and the math, they basically found that there's a whole lot of people who are dying who aren't even being counted. So it's pointing to the fact that the most marginalized people, maybe they're uninsured, maybe they're undocumented, for whatever reason, they're not even getting tested. They're not going to the doctor, and they're dying at home undiagnosed. And so that there's this whole community of people out there that it's really frightening to think about, that they're suffering in the shadows. And so that part is extremely worrisome because, it points to the fact that this problem is much bigger than we even know.
Yeah, and it, obviously, I think very much inspired the name of the documentary, right? The Hidden Toll, this invisible workforce that exists out there that is essential for our agricultural system to function. Um, and so this film does a wonderful job in kind of spotlighting this issue. And so we have a question from a Professor Ramirez asking, what do you hope for the impact of the film to be? You mentioned, right, you're glad that people are having discussions like the ones we're having right now. What impact do you want this film to make on? Is this something that you want policymakers to act on? Like, for example, the California Assemblyman who's taking some action and some leadership in this space. Ultimately, what kind of impact are you hoping this really drives, either consumers or our elected officials?
I think within within a few days or maybe a week of the film airing, by that weekend, the governor had called an emergency meeting with the Latino caucus, and then that next week he had announced, certain things that the Latino caucus had been pushing for. He announced and made some changes. And so we don't know. The thing with our film is we never know what kind of direct or indirect impact it has. Sometimes we know, but it's just, we heard from sources that the film helped in spurring those meetings and those conversations and those actions. And so I think that is something that, we as journalists are in one lane, and part of our job is to sort of reveal and and tell stories and take the, move the curtain away, and also meet human beings. I mean, there's all these different things that we do in our storytelling effort and our reporting efforts. And a lot of times, because we can present something in this contained, cohesive, narrative way, people can take that and then do different things with it. They can go to legislators and say, watch this, and that's an hour. You can take an hour to watch it. They can use it in trainings. They can show it in classrooms. They can, we've had our films shown in workplaces. So there's different ways. Cynthia Hernandez from the film, she was interviewed for a Department of Labor training that's being done for Department of Labor workers in the state of California. They recorded an interview with her. Now she'll be part of that training, and the film will be also. So there's all these different ways that, the film can take on a life of its own to influence new policy, to change existing policy, to enact new laws. I mean, our last film, Rape on the Night Shift, there was, it led to a new law, actually a couple now being enacted in California and Oregon. And so, that's, we sometimes that's our hope, is that there's like tangible change. Will there be actual workplace standards? Will that change in the immediate? And then in the long run, can the film serve as a way to look at long-term policy or laws that are, situated to sort of affect change where, there's been conversation around change, but can a film, tip the needle? Can it start a conversation? We have that desire for the work. You want the work to do something and to land in the hands of other people whose jobs it is to implement policy, create new laws. I mean, there's all kinds of, there's different jobs that do those different things. Mm-hmm. But part of our job is just to illuminate. But you always hope that then the film can go on and have impact in all these different ways, but you just never know if it's going to happen or not.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, right? You chose a documentary, a film to kind of help spread this message. But reading from the chat, there are also some questions around, do you see social media playing a role in this and kind of shedding some light on what's going on with agricultural workers? I think it might be a little bit more difficult in terms of social media, for example, for like this interior meat packing conditions. But overall, have you seen social media play a role in kind of shedding light on this, or do you find the format that a documentary provides helps kind of create those more intimate moments that gets people hooked on the issue?
Yeah, I mean, we're sort of trapped in a social media reality. I mean, it's just the way the world operates right now, for better or worse. And in a lot of times, I don't know, that's Never mind. But
it's okay. It can be a hot take.
I think imagery is powerful. I think a lot of people saw images of farm workers working in the fields during the fires. One of the images that was circulating widely on social media was actually from 2018. And so, there's also that. It's important that the representations be accurate, but yeah, social media is hugely important. It's hugely important for us, even in that's how we got to some of the stories we were reporting on, was just sort of the social media conversations happening between and among workers. A lot of workers are on social media. So, I think we also created a short that's like 3 minutes long that pulls from our film so that it can move around more easily on social media. The thing with social media is things flash and then the next thing flashes, and it's just like, there's so many flashes, right, all the time, that it's like something can flash for a moment and then you're on to the next story. And I think if you can sit down, and watch something and allow it to resonate, it's just it's different than watching a 2-minute piece, for example, but 2-minute pieces can be very powerful also. So I do think social media absolutely plays a role, especially, for us right now as journalists. A lot of this has to do with making sure our work is grounded in as much reporting and accuracy and fairness as possible, because social media has also become a universe of disinformation and attack. So it's evolving constantly. And so that's why it's helpful, for me personally, to have, outside of the social media sphere, a living sort of testament document that was created that exists outside of the sort of flashy, quick, speedy nature of social media that you can then go to and you can learn more about and spend more time with to understand the reporting.
Yeah. Next question is going to be really talking about, the time you both have advanced degrees from UC Berkeley, so you're accustomed to the UC system. Can you, Andreas, could you kind of elaborate on kind of how your experience with UC Berkeley has kind of contributed to your developing as a filmmaker, as someone who's interested in the art? We do have some students from UC Merced on the call who might be interested in pursuing a similar career, and given that you both have come from a UC system school, that might be something they might be interested in hearing.
Yeah, sure, of course. I mean, I think, journalism is one of those fields where you don't need an advanced degree to become a journalist. You can just go and be a journalist and get a job and learn it. A lot of journalism isn't rocket science. It's more of a craft that you get better at with practice, that really starts with being curious and learning how to ask questions and get information and be skeptical of information. So you don't need to go to a graduate school to learn that. But what you do get, if both Daffodil and I went to UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism, is it's a place where you can learn from other people, and you have that mentorship from the professors, and then you learn from your other peers who then you can go on to work with. So there's a lot of networking and sort of accelerated learning and growth that can happen. So I really do encourage any of you who want to specialize to be thinking about getting an advanced degree, because it's really a time for you to be working on your skills and your knowledge base. And so I think, one of the things, having come from that position of privilege, because not everybody has the opportunity to spend that time in study, is then being able to leverage those resources and that access that we have to be able to tell stories of people who may not have those same opportunities. So I think coming from that background has really driven a lot of the work that we've done.
So I know we have about 10 more minutes until 5, but I want to open it up. I've been picking questions from the chat from the audience, but if you have questions that you haven't had a chance to ask, I'm paying attention right now, so feel free to throw those in chat and I'll make sure to ask them, but if not, I can keep going with some of the.
You can turn your
questions that we
camera
have
on
now.
too. You can just ask us a question.
Yeah, if you want to hop in and have an opportunity to chat, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question, folks.
I also just shared the short that I mentioned. I just shared the Facebook and Twitter links for that short piece.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
I see a question from Nadia about follow-up. We haven't, it's kind of early for follow-up. I know that we've been in touch with Cynthia, but I don't know if we usually follow up with people immediately after the broadcast, like the next day, and, how did it go? And did you see it? And what do you think in the next couple of days? Because there's usually some sort of reaction that people get. And I think some of the people who were at the meatpacking plant, you might have gotten a little bit of blowback. I'm not sure,
Well, one of them was people were telling her that we know you're the one that came out in the film. Then I think there was a class action filed against that meatpacking company, right?
Yeah, exactly. There was a lawsuit. So it's the kind of thing where we need to keep staying in touch, but a lot of times these developments happen over months and years. But once we have these, a good example is Maricruz Ladino, who was in this piece, was one of our sources from a film that we did 7 years ago. So we're always staying in touch with people. And usually if something happens, we'll hear about it.
But yeah, that's a good question. And like Cynthia, she lost her job. Susanna, are you waving? Do you have a question?
I'm waving. I was going to ask a question when you're done answering this one.
Yeah, go ahead.
So thank you guys so much for organizing this and then for participating in this talk. A lot of the folks who are on the webinar right now are taking my course on health in the media. They are undergraduate public health majors, and they're really, throughout the semester, going to be learning about how the way the media tells stories influences policymakers' decisions and support for different policies and such. We haven't yet talked about the decisions that journalists make along the way about how to, as you mentioned, Daffodil, be balanced and make sure that you're telling facts. But I was wondering if you could talk about this film or other projects that you have worked on, how you have a point of view. You have decided that you're telling the story of the farm workers. Within that, that's a decision, right? That you may be accused of bias because you care about these particular people. But can you talk a little bit more about how you make decisions that to you are justified journalistic decisions about telling truth and fairness and bias? I know that's a huge question.
It is. It's a huge question, but it's a very important question. So I really appreciate it. I think, one of the things yes, every decision that we're making is a decision. We're not objective, robots that just, take in information and then spit it back out. We're making decisions about the fact that even we wanted to tell a story about what was going on in the agricultural industry to begin with. That's a decision that we made. And we, even though we wanted to tell the story of what was going, if you want to tell a story about what's happening with farm workers, you have to talk to farm workers, right? So that's who we went to go talk to. At the same time, we can't talk to farm workers and not talk to the companies, because those are the people who have a huge impact in what's going on with their lives. The trick that we had with this piece was that we were having a very hard time getting access to the people who were the direct employers of these workers. We did talk to Maricruz's boss, and we were able to talk to Chris Valadez. So there was some industry perspectives in there. And it's extremely important for us to do that, because when we want to corroborate what people are saying, we can't just take their word for it. Right. So if somebody says, "Oh, they treated me bad at work," I have an example with one of my students who's working on a story about workers at a McDonald's who got there was a COVID outbreak, and some of the workers are saying, "Oh, they didn't give us PPE. They gave us dog diapers and told us to use rubber bands and cover our mouths with them." And it sounds horrible. And then a reporter goes and talks to the boss and says, no, we didn't, we never did that, right? So you have to go and get the other side and see what they say. Now, somebody's telling the truth and somebody's not. So then how do you figure out what the truth is? And so that's where the reporting comes in terms of talking to as many people as possible. This is something that came up all the time in the sexual assault stories that we were doing, because often there's not evidence. That's just what one person said and what another person said. But when you find 10 women who all say that they've been assaulted, harassed by one guy, and he's denying it all, at some point you start to make an editorial decision about how you're going to portray that. You can't definitively say something happened, but you can definitely report it as, this is what 10 women said and this is what this one guy said, and then reasonable people can come to their own conclusions. So what we're always trying to find are as many fact-based pieces of evidence that we can, as something that's been recorded, documented, and then we just talk to as many people as we can, and always trying to talk to people who might have the opposite opinion of what we have. Because by going directly to that person, they'll either corroborate what we say, or they'll refute it in a way that makes us examine our premise to see if we got it right or not. So that's just, it's basic journalism, but unfortunately, again, going back to the social media news cycle, often a lot of those steps get missed. And that's why it's, you see all the time, I don't know if you guys are paying attention to the news, Trump allegedly said that, prisoners of war were losers and suckers, right? And he's saying, well, I never said that. Well, the editor at The Atlantic says, well, I talked to 4 people who said that you did, right? So it's like, okay, now we're in a battle of like, who are those 4 people? And do we believe those 4 people versus the president saying he didn't say that? So journalism is always a battle for the truth. And you want to have as much evidence behind it as possible so you can feel confident about what you're saying is actually true.
And even if you don't know, the thing is, it's also sometimes impossible to get to the truth, but so that you feel like you're presenting the best that you know. And for example, in the situation with Taylor Farms, we had the video and we showed a lot, we tried to be fair in what we showed. We didn't show every second of it, but we showed enough that sort of laid out, what the manager was saying. And when Andres spoke with him, he didn't deny that he said any of those things. He was like, yeah, that's what happened. And so, and I don't know if the latest development in the Trump situation is that then Fox News went to their sources, and their sources have confirmed what The Atlantic was reporting. So it's now become this very corroborated story, is what the word that we use, which means that multiple people are saying that that thing is true. And so it's one of the things that we as journalists use when we were looking at the meatpacking plant situation. We tried to talk to at least 3 people. Were these things going on at the meatpacking plant? Is this what it looked like when we showed video of a similar place? We had to show it to them and say, is this what your job looks like? Because we don't want to misrepresent the company that we're talking about. So there are all these places where we just have to make sure that we're being accurate and fair. Otherwise, the story can lose value and significance if you're found to be, being inaccurate in some other area, or unfairly or inaccurately representing, the workspace or the company, or what the company did or didn't do. So we're and still, despite all those efforts, there's always things that companies are, there's always things that people are going to say, we're too biased in one direction or the other. And all we can do is try to present and be as fair as possible. We tried really hard to get the companies in the film to sit down with us. We just wanted to talk with them. Mm-hmm. We wanted to give them an opportunity to explain the challenges that they're facing, the situation that they're in. But there is a lot of, I think, in your class, and I think it's really interesting that you're looking at that, Susanna, is just kind of dissecting, a story, getting in touch with the reporter. If you guys look at certain stories, invite the reporter, ask them to sort of go through their process with you, because another thing that happens is that we are talked about as the media, and actually the media is actually a pretty diverse kind of landscape. And so I think we always try to say it's important to isolate the outlet that you're talking about, and is it a trustworthy news source, and who are the editors, who are the reporters, identify specific people and stories and outlets so that we don't become just the media, because then it becomes very easy to dismiss or accept, you know, a lot of the hard work that's actually goes into all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and one of the things I want to pull out of the chat real quick, because I know a couple of people asked that, was a question of whether Cynthia lost her job as a result.
Oh, because I had mentioned she lost her job. She actually didn't. No, it didn't have to do with the film per se.
Okay.
Cynthia is a very, she's super dynamic and very aware at this point of her rights as a worker. And so when she wasn't being, in the film, you see that she's trying to get information about whether there was an infected person at work or in the cuadrilla that was next to her, what was going on. And so she's just asking questions, and she just wanted to know. And she was talking to other coworkers, and, you know, we couldn't get into all this drama in the film. We wanted to, but it was happening as we were finishing. And she was, you know, talking to, they have a mix of H-2A workers and, you know, California resident workers who are some documented, some not. And the conversations that were happening between these two groups may have alarmed her supervisors. Basically, because she was asking a lot of questions, they may have laid her off. And so she's currently she's kind of legally looking into it with the help of the United Farm Workers and her supervisor actually, who was also laid off because basically they laid her and a handful of other people off and replaced them with H-2A workers. And those are the migrant workers. There's a small percentage of them, about 10% in agriculture, but they come with a temporary work permit and then they go back. And so they're, in some ways, they're the ones least likely to speak up because they're here really to work, and they're terrified of having that visa stripped, that work permit stripped and being sent back. So there's a lot of questions still in that situation for her, but yeah, it wasn't, it actually happened just before the film aired.
Yeah, I know it's 5:04 right now currently, so I want to be respectful of both of your times and everyone's time on the call. So I'm going to say, if there's one final question, just pop it in chat. So I think it would be best to end on that note, because I know we're running a little bit over time. I'm just checking.
Thank you. You know, and also I'm happy to give you, Guillermo, if you want to share. I can type it into the chat, but I can give my email too if anyone has any follow-ups or.
Yeah, that'd be great. I think honestly we could have had this conversation for 2, 3, 4 hours. So I think it would be great for people to have the opportunity to follow up with you.
It's so great to have students on too. So great.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah. So on that note, I'm gonna conclude the panel discussion, but I want to extend my thanks to Andres and Daffodil for the film, your expertise, for shedding light on that story, and allowing us to kind of look through and see what's happening even in our own backyard, right? So thank you for all the work that you've done and you will continue to do. And I'm sure next time I'm in Berkeley, I'll want to stop by and say hi to both of you.
Definitely.
So thank you so much for
Anytime.
dedicating your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. Thanks,
everyone.
Yes, thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.